Can't really use cork. Welcome back to the Screensavers. I'm Leo Laporte. You know Photoshop. We talk about it all the time. You may use Acrobat. Do you remember the Apple Laser Writer? They were all part of the publishing revolution. And our next guest is the editor-in-chief at CreativePro.com and the author of this great book, Inside the Publishing Revolution, The Adobe Story. This is brand new from the Adobe Press. Here to tell us more about the legacy that is Adobe, Pam Pfiffner. Welcome back.
Thank you, Leo. The set's changed a lot since I worked here many years ago.
You have a beautiful book. Why Adobe? What makes Adobe so important in the revolution?
Well, I think that almost every way that we communicate today, Adobe has had some hand in it. When you think about desktop publishing, when you think about imaging, even when you think about desktop video, Adobe has had its hand in everything along the line. It doesn't matter if you use Mac or PC, you've probably used an Adobe product.
Yeah, and certainly the pros have all used an Adobe product.
Exactly. I mean, a lot of the professional artists that I talked to when I was producing this book all told me stories about how they used to use these $50,000 machines in order to produce a single image or to do video. And then this Macintosh with the software comes out and bingo, everything changes for them.
How did Adobe get started?
Adobe got started with Chuck Geschke and John Warnock, who met at Xerox PARC. They had had some technology from previous things, worked on it at Xerox PARC. Xerox PARC, great think tank, as we know, down in Silicon Valley.
Lousy getting products out the door.
Lousy getting products out the door, and Geschke and Warnock decided, hey, this is too good to squander. They went off 20 years ago this month, as a matter of fact, and started Adobe Systems in John Warnock's bedroom down in the Palo Alto area.
1982.
1982.
That was before the Mac came out.
That is before the Mac came out.
So their first products were not for the Mac? Were they for the PC?
Well, they were cooking up this crazy printing language that we now know as PostScript. And they were doing that on their own. They had a couple of different ideas about how they were going to enable people to print. Back then, printers were dumb, clanging machines with, set typefaces and so on. And Apple, Steve Jobs was working on a laser printer, and he needed a language. Adobe needed an output device. The two of them met. Warnock and Jobs especially hit it off immediately. They're very close to this day. And they got together. The Apple Laser Writer was born in 1985.
A lot of people say that the Laser Writer and PageMaker, Adobe's desktop publishing product, really made the Mac the hit it was. You bought a Mac so you could run those.
That's exactly true. And for a long time, the Laser Writer had more processing power than the Macintosh itself. You probably remember this, 128K Macintosh.
And I had 8 megs of RAM in my Laser Writer.
Exactly. And it was a big deal. And also in 1985, Apple was in a little bit of trouble. And there are those who say that because of desktop publishing with Aldus and Adobe, that Apple is around today. They could have very easily folded back then.
That's right. PageMaker was an Aldus product.
That's
I shouldn't give credit to Adobe for that.
But, it was one of those great synergies that we saw in the early part of the publishing revolution and indeed Silicon Valley, where, a bunch of entrepreneurs would get together. They'd go, hey, not of the competitiveness that we see today. It was a lot of like, hey, you got an idea, I got an idea.
We can enable this. Yours works with ours, and that makes a lot of sense.
Better to work together.
I think Adobe does publish PageMaker now.
Now it does,
They bought it
indeed.
from Aldus, or bought Aldus, probably.
They did, yeah.
What was the next product after PostScript?
After PostScript, well, there was a lot of typefaces. Again, a lot of
typefaces, yeah.
A lot of these things we take for granted now because typefaces are something that you get with your operating system. But PostScript typefaces, that was phenomenal. It enabled people, it's not carving metal anymore. It's making software programs and making these great typefaces. And then using PostScript, they were enabled to turn that into an application. Adobe Illustrator was in 1987.
In fact, you have a great picture in here. We have Burt Monroy on all the time, of course, is the great fine artist who uses Photoshop to create his creations. And there's a picture of his first Adobe Illustrator painting that he did. This is when he was still using pen and paper most of the time. He did this with Illustrator, this train, and in fact there's a Macintosh hidden in there.
There is. It's actually really fun when you go to see Burt in his studio. He keeps magnifying and magnifying and magnifying, and somewhere down in this wheel is
I don't know if
like
you'll be able
this
to find it.
1 pixel high Macintosh. But this also shows the power of PostScript, again, which we kind of take for granted these days, that you had this very smooth, scalable graphic.
Big or little.
Exactly.
Now, Bert now worked very hard to create, with Adobe, and many other artists did, to create Photoshop. This is an early Bert.
It's from 1990. This is from the very first version of Photoshop.
Photoshop 1?
Photoshop 1, which was a product that essentially nobody really knew what to do with. Adobe thought it might sell about 200 copies a month.
And we're up to version 7 now.
We're on version 7 now, which is OS 10 compatible.
Yeah.
But Photoshop, there are jokes at Adobe that there are these massive skyscrapers that is Adobe Central down in San Jose, and they say that the first 2 buildings at Adobe were constructed from Photoshop profits. So
what happened to Chuck Geschke and John Warnock? Are they still around? They still running Adobe?
They're still around. No, they retired. Chuck retired a couple of years ago, and John a year after that. They both still live down in the peninsula. They see each other pretty frequently. They live very close to each other. They're best of buddies. And it's an interesting thing because you think about the great partnerships that formed the foundation of Silicon Valley. You always think of like Hewlett and Packard.
Right.
In my opinion, Warnock and Geschke is a pair that's often overlooked. You talk to anybody about these guys, they're the nicest guys.
Yeah.
They were fundamental engineers. They weren't like in it for the money.
Right.
They were in it because they wanted to make a difference.
Boy, did they, too. And you're right. They're kind of unsung heroes. This book will help, I think, people remember what they did inside the publishing revolution, the Adobe story. Adobe is one of the success stories that's still going strong despite the tech bust. Adobe is just as profitable and doing just as well.
Well, one of the things that I think many people overlook is that when you talk about personal software as in desktop applications, Adobe is second only to Microsoft in terms of its size. And certainly when you think about influence, I might argue that they're right up there. Yeah, exactly.
Pam, thank you so much for a great book and for joining us. We really appreciate it.
It's good to see you again, Leo. Happy holidays.
Pam, of course, as you saw, ran the website when we first started
That's
CDTV.
Correct. Yeah.
About 100 years ago. Now at CreativePro.com. You check that site out, and if you're wondering if you like the book, you can read some excerpts on our website at thescreensavers.com.
It makes a lovely holiday gift.
I say that all the time about my book, but this one is actually true. So do go out and get it, Inside the Publishing Revolution.